Compare and contrast the colonial strategies of the Spanish, French, and British in North America. What do you think are the most important elements in how each colony developed? And there's a couple main aspects that are going to determine this for each group. First is what primarily do the Europeans want in each location? Of course, early on, the Spanish are going to want gold. Primarily, the British are going to want land, and the French are going to want access to the trade networks established by American Indian groups. And this is very much going to impact how each of these colonies develop to try to sort of accomplish these goals. To a certain degree, in all three cases, though, what they're going to want to do is bring wealth back to their mother country, right? That's going to be the main goal, whether it is through those trade goods, whether it is through those gold, or increasingly it's going to be in the southern British colonies and the Caribbean, the use of plantations and growing cash crops. We'll talk about this more next week, but if you don't know what a cash crop is, essentially a cash crop is a crop that you're not growing for sustenance, you're not growing it to survive off of, you're growing it only to sell it and make profit. So things like sugar becomes a huge cash crop. Tobacco in the southern colonies becomes a cash crop. Coffee in the Andes. These are going to be cash crops which are going to be grown, and oftentimes they're going to be implying enslaved individuals as labor on these plantations to try to make them as profitable as possible. We'll be talking more about that next week. But sort of what each colony wants is very much going to be, or what each sort of country wants is very much going to be influencing how they are being set up. Another thing to think about is how much direct control does each government have on their colonies. Very early on, the Spanish have not a, the Spanish crown doesn't have a ton of control, right? It's sort of the conquistadors all doing their own thing. The owners of those encomiendas all sort of, making the American Indians that were assigned to them work and try to find profit and make profit for them. But as time goes on, that's going to change, and the Spanish crown is going to be exerting much more direct control in the Americas, which is going to have some pretty profound impacts on how Spain is going to be developing. In Britain early on, there was also very much not a lot of direct control. Like the New England colonies are going to sort of be able to do their own things. The middle colonies, Maryland, is going to be able to do its own thing. The southern colonies, Jamestown and Virginia, or eventually the Carolinas, they're going to be doing their own thing. And the British, even though, there's supposed to be revenue and so forth coming back to the British crown, it's not like Spain where there are these large gold shipments, routinely being shipped back, or eventually the direct governmental control that they are going to be influencing and exerting on their colonies. The French are going to have certainly a close relationship with sort of French authorities, primarily through the creation of these sort of large companies, which are going to be developing these relationships with American Indian groups and sending sort of their own representatives into the heartland of the continent to make these exchanges with American Indian groups. Of course, that's where you get the idea of voyageurs, right? Essentially, people who are going to be hired and paid to go into the interior of the Americas, exchange goods with American Indians, bring those furs back to the coast, and then sent back to England. So a pretty sophisticated network is going to be developed within Spain, or within France, New France, and it's going to be very much be run by these sort of large sort of almost proto-corporate systems, which are developed there to sort of conduct this very complex trading system. And of course, the relationship with American Indians is also going to have a profound impact on how each of them develops. We already talked about sort of the impact that American Indian culture is going to have on the Spanish colonies. And that's not something I think you can really sort of understate. I mean, even if you look at the religion, even though it is Catholic in South American countries today, it's really a different sort of form of Catholicism than you see in other locations. There's still a lot of holidays that are tied to traditional American Indian holidays systems. There's other nuances to the way religion is practiced there, which is very much sort of impacted by the native religions, which are they were coming into contact with. The bureaucratic systems which are developed in the Spanish colonies are going to be very much also impacted and influenced by the governing systems of those large states that they came in contact with. So just being able to sort of build upon large structures which are already in place before the time of contact is very much going to influence how the Spanish colonies look and behave, as well as the large amount of cultural mixing between the Spanish and the American Indians, where eventually a large percentage of the population is going to have ancestry from both Europe and from the Americas, and that's very much going to impact the way they perceive themselves and the way they relate and interact with American Indian groups. The British, who as we already talked about, are going to have a much more strained relationship with American Indians. They want the land, which is going to put them in direct conflict oftentimes with American Indians. Those very intense religious ideas are going to put them at sort of an ideological odds with American Indians. And because they didn't really want to, be involved primarily with converting the Indians at this point in time, rather as the Spanish had, there weren't a lot of missionaries or people like that going into American Indian communities and interacting with them, like there were in both the French and the Spanish colonies, which once more, fewer intermediaries leads to more conflicts and essentially sort of a more strained, worse relationship. And a lot of times those British colonies are going to feel a lot more threatened than by American Indian groups because there just wasn't as much knowledge of them and there was a lot longer history of conflict. The French, on the other hand, have, for the most part, very good relationships with American Indian groups. They have very strong alliances with very sort of powerful confederacies, such as the Iroquois, the Ojibwe, eventually the Dakota, even here in Minnesota. And that these are going to be used to bring a lot of those trade relationships and establish those trade relationships and try to make them sort of mutually beneficial to bring as much of the sort of items that the French want back to their colonies. It also is going to lead to a much higher degree of cultural mixing in France too, as you have oftentimes these relationships being not just business relationships but familiar relationships, as traders would be married into a tribe so that they could essentially be sort of conducting business as families. And this was a tradition that American Indians had been establishing and engaging in for centuries, that if you essentially are married to someone from another tribe, you can consider that other tribe part of your family, and then you are going to be more likely to have their best interest in mind, make fair deals, and that business is going to be done a lot easier if you are essentially working with people who you can consider part of your extended family. The French very much are going to be buying into this. So you have also in France a very large population, which they're going to call the Métis population, of sort of mixture between French and American Indian people, who are once more going to be fantastic sort of go-betweens and arbiters between American Indian populations and French populations. A lot of times they are going to be the voyagers who are going around. They're going to be the traders who are setting up trading posts and so forth. And that it very much is going to influence the way that the French colonies are going to be looking. And the last thing I'll mention here is all these colonies are going to be changing throughout time, just the way, because this is the way they're sort of being developed at this point in time. The main thing that's going to influence how they're developing moving forward is sort of how they are fitting into the expanding Atlantic world. The world of the Atlantic, meaning Europe, Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, the coast there in South America, and North America are all going to become increasingly interconnected with one another. Trade and commerce is going to become easier, along with just transportation and travel. News is going to be exchanged much faster. Populations are going to be changing as more and different people from Europe choose to move into the Americas. And all of this is going to be very much influencing how these various locations are going to be developing over the next couple hundred of years. So we'll be seeing that in our upcoming units. Facing pressure from Europeans and their accompanying diseases, how did the indigenous people of the Americas adapt and survive? What are some methods they utilized, and what are some of the examples of how they chose to interact with Europeans? So a lot of students did a good job pointing out once more so the devastating impact of those Columbian exchange diseases, and how they diminish such a large percentage of the American Indian populations. But you needed to take your answer farther than that. If that's all you were talking about, that's really just covering once again information we talked about and learned about last week. This week now was focusing more on moving forward in time after those diseases had their devastating effects. How were these American Indian groups able to reform themselves and move forward? Um, and a good example of this, a lot of people pointed out, was the formation of new political units. How oftentimes areas would have been very much depopulated by these diseases, and how the American Indians were able to come together, and maybe people who had once previously been from three or four different tribal groups or clan groups able to unite together and start rebuilding their populations and their societies. And certainly this was going to be a long rebuilding process. There's no way you can have that huge of a demographic impact and think things are going to immediately get back to the way things were. So when they do start coming into contact with Europeans, many times these are groups that are just starting to kind of rebuild themselves and reconstitute themselves. And one of the questions that's sometimes raised is in contact with these European groups, particularly the British and the French, who come over not necessarily as conquerors in the same vein as the Spanish came over, um, but are still eventually going to have lots and lots of conflicts with the American Indians. Why didn't the American Indians sort of immediately recognize the threat and and try to sort of nip the colonies in the bud before they could grow into a larger problem? And this is really comes back to, I think, of this idea of a lot of times newly much weaker political units than would have been there previously, and how oftentimes Europeans were seen as potential allies, as people who could be trading partners. American Indians realized that they had goods that Europeans wanted, and that the Europeans had goods that they wanted, and said, hey, this can be mutually beneficial. We can both help each other out through this trading process. And that's going to work very well in a place like the New France in today, modern day Canada, where the main goal of the French was to engage and establish those trading relationships and foster those trading relationships. So it's not surprising that those groups of American Indians who are able to connect with the French and sort of become their allies are going to make that a very central foundation of their lifeways and survivability moving forward, because it becomes very mutually beneficial and profitable to both sides. And even one of the reasons why those American Indian groups are willing to sometimes just right out feed the very early English colonies so they don't starve is because they want a group who they can trade with and exchange with, and also potentially make political alliances with. Remember, even though these are newly formed political groups, oftentimes there's still rivalries, there's still competitions, there's still other groups, American Indian groups, that they're in competition with. And they really didn't see the Europeans as being this different outside people. Essentially, they just sort of looked at them as being a different political organization, like all the political organizations that they dealt with of other American Indian groups, that could be, brought into an alliance, could be utilized, could be made friends potentially of. And we already talked about the trade aspect of it, and they didn't view them as a sort of outside invading force really until it gets to be too late, when suddenly they start realizing that, oh, this isn't just a few people showing up here to establish sort of trading posts, that they are now here for a much longer period of time and are wanting more and more of our land. That's when you start getting conflicts, and that's another way that American Indians start dealing with Europeans is, when the Europeans push too far, whether it is in the case of the Spanish trying to convert American Indians, whether it is in grabbing too much land in the case of the northern British colonies, whether it is trying to take American Indians as slaves, as the case is in the southern British colonies. A lot of times this is going to spark wars and pushback, and sometimes Europeans win these wars, sometimes American Indians win these wars. As time goes on, it becomes harder and harder for American Indians to win these conflicts, but that's certainly another way that American Indians deal with this, is when things get too bad, they do fight back. And really, which of these options American Indians use is typically based upon what they think is in their best interest. But a lot of times, like I said, it's making the best of usually not great options available to them. And those options are only going to get worse and worse as time goes on and more of their land is taken up by Europeans, and they're continually pushed further and further westward. So this question was asking you to draw, paint, or graphically design three symbols, being a mark, sign, or image that indicates, signifies, or is understood as representing an idea, object, or relationship. So three symbols that represent three different African kingdoms: the Songhai, the Congo, or the Ndongo. I'd like to explain why each of the symbols represented is significant. And overall, the class did a fantastic job on this. I thought there was a lot of really cool creativity, different ways to try to interpret the three different kingdoms and sort of bring that information visually um, into play. Just to go through some of what the class came up with Songhai, I saw a lot of emphasis on trade, looking at trading salt and textiles and metal goods for gold oftentimes. I saw their relationship with Islam and how important that was being depicted here with some Islamic symbols. Also, the University at Timbuktu and how that was sort of became a center of knowledge and learning was also depicted in some people's representation and symbols. So, very good job depicting the Songhai. For the Congo, I saw some images of sort of depicting what a strong state the Congo was, how their military, judicial, and financial affairs were very sort of regulated and established. I saw a lot of people making allusions to the alliance with the Portuguese, like shaking hands or exchanging goods. Also, some really good symbols about how Christianity becomes the religion of the Congo. Congo of the Bell is what some of the contemporaries called it because of how many churches there were, and some people actually used the image of the bell in their depiction of the Congo, which I thought was a really good way to take what was presented in the text and put it into a symbol. And also trade. How trade was very important, particularly between the Congo and the Portuguese. How the Congo were trading textiles, weapons, and advisors, oftentimes for things like copper or ivory, and of course slaves, as Congo becomes one of the main sort of slave trading hubs. To transport and sort of collect slaves from the interior of Africa and then trade them to Europeans. So that's another thing that oftentimes was brought up in the symbolism, how sort of these kingdoms were very much central to this emerging slave trade. For the Ndongo, you saw a lot of the same sort of images of the relationship with the Portuguese, how they were also trading partners, but a little bit more of a complex relationship, where the Portuguese sort of wanted to sort of make the entire area into sort of a slave trading sort of kingdom almost. There was a lot more pushback from the Ndongo kingdoms, and particularly, I know I saw a lot of people depicting of Queen Nzinga, who was very strong in fighting back against the Portuguese, trying to keep them from taking over. Was very successful for many years. The Portuguese both sort of respected and feared her to a large degree, even though in the end she was not able to completely kick the Portuguese out. She made their lives a lot more difficult for a long time. And also some people were depicting sort of her idea of a flipped gender roles. How it was very interesting how she portrayed herself as a king. She wanted herself to be referred to as king. And she even sort of flipped the roles of sort of the court, where she had her own concubines who were essentially men dressed up as women, and she was a woman dressed up as a man. So still trying to keep some of that same sort of patriarchal imagery, but sort of turning the whole thing on its head, and while simultaneously sort of running a kingdom and fighting back against a colonizing force. A pretty amazing thing. So I think the depictions of Queen Nzinga were very much kind of on point here for the Ndongo. But overall, no matter how you decided to depict these, I thought overall the class did a fantastic job. Why do you believe such a brutal and oppressive form of slavery developed in the Americas? Um, and the class overall did a very good job, and this is a very complex and question, and really I think deserves a very long and detailed answer. So a lot of the students sort of brought in bits and pieces, I think, of the total, but I'll try to sort of put them all together here in this review. And of course, as it was discussed in the PowerPoint, Slavery has been around for pretty much ever since human beings were creating large agricultural states, um, and that was nothing new. However, the form and the brutality and the longevity of the slave system that's developed in the Americas is in a lot of ways an anomaly from what we saw historically. And this was due, I think, for a number of reasons. Um, First of all, for the Europeans who were coming into contact and looking early on for people to work on their plantations, whether it was trying to take advantage of American Indian populations or later trying to obtain enslaved individuals from Africa, uh, a lot of them in European culture at this point in time, there wasn't an idea really of human rights. That people sort of had rights that should be honored or respected. Europe itself was a very hierarchical society. Um, and certainly the people at the top had certain rights and privileges and so forth, but the vast majority of people did not. And it certainly was not unusual for people of the peasant class or the lower classes to be victimized and used, maybe not quite in the same way as the slaves are going to be used, but in some way, shape, or form taken advantage of. So that perspective wasn't necessarily anything new to a lot of people entering into this slave system. Um, but I think it gets heightened in this case for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's very clear, distinct cultural and religious differences between the Europeans and the enslaved individuals from Africa or the American Indians that they are attempting to enslave. And that skin color becomes used to try to symbolize these cultural and religious differences with sort of the connotation that people who look like Europeans and have light colored skin are somehow good, and people who have colored skin and have a different culture and different religion and so forth must be inherently evil. This is one of the reasons why you see so many conflicts springing up between sort of early colonists in the British colonies and American Indians, is because there was a lot of resentment and fear and hatred just because of the way people, the American Indians looked in those colonies, which certainly, as time goes on, does not help the relationship between them. The same thing happens in the slave trade. And really, when you have those differences and you already have the disposition to dislike someone based upon how they look and their cultural differences, it becomes much easier than to dehumanize them. And I think that becomes the key. The only way that you have a brutal and cruel slave system like you see developing in the Americas created is that there has to be an incredibly high level of dehumanization at work, where you can't view all these awful things you're doing as being inflicted upon another person. You have to find ways to make the person that you're doing this to seem less human, and that becomes a key across the board to how this ends up developing. The other big consideration and why this becomes so widespread is the idea of demand. If there wasn't such a high demand for enslaved people, certainly the system wouldn't have been as widespread. It probably wouldn't have become as entrenched and central to a lot of these locations and colonies in the Americas, and probably wouldn't have taken on such a harsh form. But the key here were cash crops, as the vast majority of enslaved peoples in the Americas were being sent to work on these plantations growing cash crops. What is a cash crop? Just so we're all on the same page. A cash crop essentially is a crop that you plant in the ground, you grow it, you harvest it, not for sustenance, not to survive, but to sell and to make money. So the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, they're not eating all that sugar on the plantations or even on the islands that they're on. They're sending all that sugar back to Europe and receiving money for it. On the tobacco plantations in the southern British colonies, they're not growing that to use in the colonies. They're growing that to ship it back to England to make profit. So that's what a cash crop is, something you're growing specifically to sell to make money off of. And oftentimes these cash crops involved a lot of hard and brutal work, and work that just quite frankly regular people didn't want to do if they had a choice. But at the same point in time, the crops themselves were very, very profitable. You could make really a lot of money by selling these. So you put these two things together, and that really creates just sort of an insatiable demand for slaves because people didn't want to do the work themselves, but they wanted to make all the money. And essentially, the only way to sort of expand your operations was to plant more crops, and to plant more crops and harvest more crops, you needed more enslaved people than to do it. And really, the choice of slaves over paid labor was really just a decision to maximize profitability. And I think if you look at it that way, it really is just a calculation that people made where, well, yes, we could still make profit on these plant stations hiring people from Europe, but our profit margins would be much smaller when we wouldn't be getting nearly as rich. So we can really get a lot more money by cutting our labor costs to essentially zero and just getting enslaved people to do the work for us. And this shouldn't necessarily be a completely foreign concept. If you look at even the world we live in today, the number one way oftentimes that businesses try to cut costs is to cut labor costs. Thankfully, we live in a society where we've now said that no, you can't cut those costs by essentially down to zero and force people to do the work. But remember, that's only in our country. There are still places around the world where you do have sweatshops, and people are still making that calculation that money is more important than the humans who are working for them. And I think that's something that should be noted as well. So you can certainly see how and why this kind of demand was created. Also, you have a very high degree of cultural isolation between enslaved individuals. And this really only heightens the importance of race, where people are coming from Africa to a completely new area. They're very disoriented. They're oftentimes on plantations of people who speak different languages, even different African languages than they speak. And it really inhibits their ability to fight back and to escape. Of course, some of the early attempts at and creating slave systems were based around American Indian populations. But oftentimes the American Indians were really good at escaping and rejoining groups that they'd been taken from fighting back, from harvesting rebellions, and the owners of these plantations quickly sort of determined that taking people completely out of their element and what they're accustomed to and putting them into a completely new location is a good way to cut back on sort of the ability and willingness to fight back by these enslaved individuals. And all this comes together in these locations in the Caribbean, in the British colonies, to form what oftentimes is considered a slave society, a society that is essentially built up and supported by labor of enslaved peoples. And there have been various slave societies throughout history, and oftentimes when you have a society that is completely dependent upon slave labor, that system becomes a lot more harsh, a lot more rigid, and a lot more brutal than if you're just in a society where, yeah, slavery is allowed, but it's just kind of mixed in. And oftentimes these slave societies are in locations where the vast amount of slave labor is being used for agricultural work. Typically that had been to support some other population or class through food. In this case, it is through the creation of those cash crops, but the result is kind of the same. And also what you end up seeing in these slave societies is a really high level of social stratification, meaning there's a very wide gap between social classes. So oftentimes you have a plantation owner class, the people who own the land, who own the slaves, who are incredibly wealthy and incredibly rich. Then you typically have not much of a middle class and a lot of a poor class of whatever the dominant group is. So in this case, poor whites, making up some trades, sometimes on their own small subsistence farms, but they're not able to afford enslaved people or choose not to use enslaved people, and they are never able to become nearly as profitable as those plantation owners. So there's a huge divide between a small number of very wealthy people, a large number of non-wealthy people, and then of course oftentimes an even larger population of enslaved people who have, pretty much no property and no rights at the very bottom. And ultimately, you see the creation of a lot of systems to try to protect these new slave societies. Oftentimes, it is the plantation owners who are creating the rules, who are creating these sort of local governments, who are enforcing these rules. And pretty much their primary interest is trying to create systems through laws, through practice, through social pressures that entrench and support their position within society. So a great example of this is the concept of hypodescent, which essentially just means that if you are a child of an enslaved person, you are automatically considered a slave yourself. Now, regardless of who the father is, if your mother was a slave, you are going to be a slave too. And this is one of the things that definitely makes the slave system in the Americas so terrible, is because there's no way out of this loop of slavery. If you're born a slave, you're going to be a die slave, and any of your children are going to be slaves as well. And this is, in a lot of ways, an abnormality in slave systems. Quite typically what you see happening, for example, traditional slavery in Africa, traditional slavery in the Americas, as well as other locations in Eurasia, is that sure, someone might be a slave for their life, but if they have children, quite typically those children would not be slaves. They would be free. They would join whatever the rest of society was. Sometimes they'd be considered part of the family unit that they were born into. And in that way, yes, slavery was poor for and bad, and certainly don't want to underestimate how terrible it would be for individuals who were placed into it. But oftentimes their children could have the opportunity of having a better life than they do, and breaking that system. Not so with the slavery in the Americas, and also this is also going to lead to a very high degree of sexual violence against enslaved women, where they are sort of seen as just there to produce more slaves, and oftentimes they're very being sexually exploited to make that happen, to make their lives even harder and even worse through this entire process. You also see the passing of slave codes, as for example we're going to see in our primary source document this year, which are essentially there to regulate all behavior of enslaved individuals and offer very harsh punishments for any violation of that behavior. So making sure it's very rigid what an enslaved person can do and what they cannot do, with the main goal of trying to make sure that they're always going to be never having time to plan an escape, never have an opportunity to get together and form a rebellion, and never have that opportunity to fight back against this system. And in a lot of ways, slave societies are very unstable because having just a very small amount of people at the top and everyone else struggling in one way, shape, or form or another at the bottom. It doesn't. In theory, it shouldn't take long for those people to say, "Hey, this system isn't really serving any of us well, whether you're a poor white or you're an enslaved person. Why don't we get together and try to end this?" Well, the solution that comes up with this, and what ultimately makes this form of slavery, I would say, both terrible but also so enduring, is the development of racism. How increasingly poor whites are being told that they need to fear, resent, and hate enslaved people, specifically to make sure that they don't make common cause with them, because both the poor whites and the enslaved people have the most to gain in society. The plantation owners have the most to lose. So trying to instill these ideas of racism between people of different racial groups becomes a very potent tool in the Americas, and one that we are still fighting with and still dealing with today, because this is really the beginnings of our modern day ideas and perceptions of race in this country and race relations. And it comes down to trying to make sure that people who should have a lot in common and should be fighting back against a system that is not serving anyone well is going to spend so much time fearing and hating each other that they can't have enough energy or can't realize or figure out that no one's best interests are being served if 5% of the population controls 90% of the land and 95% of the wealth. And really, once ideas of human rights and political rights do start to become more common, as they are going to be doing here in just a couple hundred years, you then see racism being used to further dehumanize enslaved individuals, because once more becomes more important if there are suddenly these ideas coming out of the European Enlightenment, which we'll be discussing in a few weeks here, that there are things as natural rights and human rights, and that people should have representation in a government, and that people should have unalienable rights. You start seeing a clear hypocrisy between the people in these colonies who are saying, yes, we want political rights and political freedoms, but we're denying it for the vast majority of our populations. So in order to combat that, they sort of double down on that idea of racism and really start tying in not just that enslaved peoples are different and sort of form their own separate class, and that's just sort of bad luck or God's divine will, which had sort of typically been the way that enslaved people were perceived prior to this. But increasingly, they start trying to make slaves seem more threatening, more aggressive. So you got to make sure to keep these very strict slave codes in place, making them also seem lazy and stupid, and trying to make everything they can do to try to further dehumanize these enslaved peoples. And that sort of serves a two front, trying to say, well, if they're not really humans, we don't necessarily have to give them rights. And on the second hand, trying to make sure that poor whites understand that, well, no matter how bad our lot is or our life is, well, at least we're not an enslaved person. At least we're not a slave. At least there's someone in society that we're better than. And trying to use that racist idea and ideology to once more keep them in line within this broader system, and to keep as few people as possible questioning with these emerging ideas of human rights and natural rights, why those aren't being applied to such a large percentage of your population. So a long and complex and convoluted answer, and I'm sure I did not touch on all the points here, but those are just some of the reasons why you see the slave system in the Americas becoming so distinct, so harsh, and so brutal through this time. So looking at the asking everyone to put on your teacher hats and design a quick lesson plan for teaching a high school class about the economy of the Atlantic world. So for learning objectives, I saw what a lot of people were putting in there was the idea of interconnectivity, of regional specialization, um, of just sort of looking at how the Atlantic world is changing throughout time and becoming more interdependent in a lot of ways. Some of the important terms that people came up with, sort of the triangle trade, the idea of people being able to make a route and trade route from Europe down to Africa to the Caribbean to North America and back to Europe again, and how at sort of each stop they're able to either pick up or unload some sort of cargo and sort of make themselves more profitable as they went along. Some people, put in specific locations that were important on this sort of triangular trade route, like Angola or Barbados or Boston. A lot of people put in things like trade goods, guns, enslaved people, enslaved individuals, sugar, rum, furs. That these are all aspects and goods that are going to be very much making the rounds throughout the Atlantic world and connecting these various locations. A lot of people also mentioned the slave trade, the African diaspora, the importance of cash crops. These are very much also going to be important factors. And I also thought the class did a very good job coming up with some interesting activities that could be achieved. Some people talked about like an exchange game that you could potentially do with various goods. Someone sort of combined that idea of a map activity where you could have a map and have sort of different depictions of various trade goods at various locations and see where they started and where they ended up. Some people or some person had the idea of using sort of the primary sources like we normally do, but having it sort of tied in with the important terms. A trivia game to try to sort of test people's knowledge, breaking the class up and doing presentations on different aspects of the Atlantic world. These were all very good ideas that you came up with. So I was glad you were all able to sort of start thinking a little bit like teachers, whether or not that's an ultimate goal of yours or not. It's still sort of fun to say, well, if I was doing this, this is how I do it. So a good opportunity for that here, and I think the class overall did a fantastic job. So I know the document exercises this week were tough to read. It's very tough to read these kind of accounts of, what actually happened during the slave trade to enslaved individuals once they got to the Americas. And certainly is one of the darkest periods, I would say, of human history, of what a terrible, terrible time this ended up being for so many people. And I thought the class did a very good job of tackling these issues, of treating them very seriously, and trying to learn some really strong lessons from them, which I think is the only kind of lessons you can or should be learning from these kind of documents. So question number one, what do these documents reveal about the African slave trade and/or slavery in the Americas? And really, the documents here, uh, a lot of the people in the class pointed out, sort of represent the various steps that were involved in the slave trading process, from being abducted in Africa or obtained somehow in Africa, in this case being kidnapped, young children being taken away from their families, through the process of being transported across the Atlantic, and then sort of what kind of a life was awaiting these new enslaved individuals when they got to the Americas. So all the various steps are sort of in one shape or form represented here to a certain degree. Also, a lot of people pointed out that it definitely showed the hardships that were endured by the slaves, how these people were treated. Another thing that stood out to people was just the amount of people involved, how there were so many people involved in kidnapping and capturing um, people from the interiors of Africa, transporting them, and then, of course, setting up the entire slave system in the Americas. Tons and tons of people are essentially creating this system. It's not just a few people here and there engaging in it. It's an incredibly large and wide um, system that has been created here, and certainly the documents I think show lots of evidence of that as well. So question number two, what hardships and mistreatment are endured by enslaved Africans in these documents? And yeah, I mean, the class did a very good job identifying them. I mean, this is a question, unfortunately, where the answers are pretty obvious. Being kidnapped, being separated from your family, being starved and exhausted, these long marches and walks to the ports, being cramped into these incredibly tightly into these horrific slave ships, sort of the unsanitary conditions that for a lot of people, we're sort of saying it was making them sick to their stomachs, even reading about them. The idea that these people are being forced to eat, and if they weren't there, sort of being burned with coals. The depictions of how women are being pretty routinely raped on these slave ships shows you that that's 100% something that is very real and happening, just another nightmare that they're having to endure. And once they get to the Americas, that there's a system set up where it's completely depriving them of all their rights. They're subject to very harsh laws, almost seemingly the smallest penalty they're going to be paying for, either being very brutally beaten or outright killed. For going against any of these slave laws and codes that are being created in the Americas. And really, almost every way a person's human rights can be violated, you see evidence of that here in these documents. So, question three, what are the lessons that we can or should learn from the African slave trade and slavery in the Americas? And certainly on the surface level, a lot of people did a very good job depicting that, yes, slavery is really bad. It's a horrible and horrendous thing. It was actually very terrible what these people had to go through and endure. And kind of back to that idea that we can't learn from our mistakes if we don't admit making any. And if you can't admit that the slave trade was a mistake, I think you got to kind of look at the perspective that you're coming from, because this is really the worst possible things you could do to another person, and it's being done here wholesale. So certainly saying that if we want to learn from mistakes, this is a huge mistake that we need to learn from. And it's not a given. There are forces out there right now in America that don't want us learning about this information, who don't want this information being taught because, they feel like it does make certain people look bad. And I'll be talking about in a minute, it's not too hard to eventually start tracing how all of these things add up throughout time and really do inform the present that we live in today. So unfortunately, there is a concerted effort by some to try to remove this from education, from high school education, from college education. And I think that's something we all have to be wary about and not to let happen, because simply trying to ignore the bad parts of history are not the appropriate way to deal with them. And I think this also, and a lot of people brought this point up too, reveals the danger of dehumanizing people. That in order for this process to work, there had to be such a level of dehumanization at play, because people just aren't designed to enact this kind of cruelty on one another just at face value. You have to really cut out all forms of empathy in order to make that happen. And really, the only way to cut out your empathy like that is to make it seem like you're dealing with something that is not another person or another human being. And it's incredibly sad, but people can justify doing almost anything to another person with the proper level of dehumanization. And certainly the slave trade is a perfect example of that. Um, and so I think that's, if you're looking at the lessons to learn for modern day, we have to be so careful when we start trying to dehumanize other people, whether they're like us or not, whether they come from a different culture or not, whether they come from a different country or not. Trying to find ways to dehumanize them is incredibly dangerous, because throughout time, the end result is going to be, or and can be, this kind of level of cruelty and violence. Another perfect example is what occurs in Nazi Germany to the Jewish population. Eventually, 6 million Jews are killed in the Holocaust. And the only way that was possible was that the Nazi government spent, over a decade building off of what had already been hundreds of years, really, of anti-Semitic sentiments within Europe, really building upon those for over a decade, and really trying to do everything they could to dehumanize a population to the point where they could try to essentially exterminate an entire group from this planet, and could get to that level. And I would say the slave trade is just as strong as an example of the horrors and the dangers of trying to dehumanize people and groups, whether it's based on religion or race or ethnicity, or any other category you want to come up with. Other people also brought up the idea that slavery still exists in the world. It has not, been completely eradicated. How all these terrible things which happen at this point in time, to a certain degree, are still going on at various locations, and maybe they're not present within the United States to the same degree, certainly, that they were at this point in time, but they are still there, and we need to, if we're going to be saying this was terrible then, be saying this is just as terrible now, and be doing everything that we can to try to stop people from being mistreated in this way, because, like I mentioned, that dehumanizing process hasn't stopped. It's not just related to history, it's still ongoing to this day and is very active in lots of places around the world. And finally, I think it's incredibly important to learn and understand how this system came into place, because in a lot of ways, the system that was developed now, or is developed at this point in time, is still incredibly pertinent now and today. And if you want to look at race in America today and the conversations we're having, and sort of understand how our current country came to be, you have to start with this time period and with the slave system which was developed in the colonies, which eventually became the slave system that the United States developed when it becomes a country and defended and hung on to for an incredibly long period of time. And in certain instances, the same systems that were used to create the slave system at this point in time eventually get baked into laws, into the Constitution, and into our government, which are still at play today. The idea of systemic racism, while certainly most of the codes or laws and so forth are not as rigid and obvious as the slave codes, that there are still leftovers from this time period up until today, which are impacting, Black Americans and Americans of color to a much, higher degree than white Americans. And just looking at the way the United States looks today, and remembering that for hundreds of years, the colonies and then the United States did pretty much everything within its power to keep people of color and Black Americans from achieving any level of wealth or status or success. And that it's only been in one generation where that started to change. And it's incredibly obvious when you actually start looking at the history how no, just one generation isn't going to be enough to completely eradicate hundreds of years of this kind of tyranny and abuse. And that's why there are still so many injustices here in the United States today, why there is systemic racism still very much impacting so many people today. And it does date and directly relate back to this time period that we are that we were discussing.